Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast with me, Susie Barry, and my husband and fellow master of wine, Peter Richards. Welcome to this, our Season 7 opener. And there's lots, as ever, going on.
Yes, hello, welcome. One of those things going on, as we mentioned towards the end of Season 6 and explain in our Season 7 trailer, is that we finally got round to introducing subscriptions. Huge thanks if you've already subscribed. If you haven't, head to wineblast.co.uk or click the link in our show notes. We would love to have you join the Wine Blast Plus Club and would really appreciate your support to help keep the show thriving and delivering properly in-depth, opinionated, entertaining content on a regular basis.
In return, subscribers will get early access to episodes as soon as they drop, including both parts of this interview, as well as full archive access as our back catalogue gradually starts to become subscriber only. Not only that, but we'll be putting out exclusive bonus content just for subscribers, including a series of uncut interviews from our back catalogue that have never been aired in full. We're kicking off with wine legend Hugh Johnson, but we are also lining up the likes of Sam Neill, Tim Spector, Oz Clarke, John Malkovich, Charles Spence, Virginia Wilcock, Miguel Torres, Laura Catena, and others. Some absolute gems there, and we can't wait to share those.
Yeah, so times have changed, but necessary ones. So please do support us if you can, and that will enable us to keep growing this wonderful Wine Blast global community, which is such a magical thing. Plus, if we get enough active subscribers, we can definitely look to increase the benefits to do even more fun and exciting things, and hopefully develop the show in other ways too. We have an early bird discount of 15% off if you use the code Magnum25. Head to wineblast.co.uk, but be quick because that's a limited time offer.
So certainly lots going on. One other thing going on is our interview with Jancis Robinson. Oh yes.
OMG.
Without doubt, the leading wine writer in the world today, author and editor of the best wine reference books in existence, presenter and maker of numerous TV and radio shows on wine, Financial Times wine correspondent for the past 35 years, winner of countless awards. It takes a long time to even read through the summarised list. In short, a wine superstar. Now, here's a taster of what's coming up.
I mean, the great thing about wine is it facilitates conversation. And not just conversation about wine. That's what I love. I was thinking about it. I'm probably addicted to it. I think about one wine I did write. Well, it's wet.
So yes, we were given privileged access to this wine VVIP. I went for an intimate chat at Jancis's uber contemporary flat, which sits high above the buzzy King's Cross redevelopment and enjoys panoramic views over London, one of the wine world's great hubs, of course. The perfect place to reflect on her life and career as she celebrates 50 years of wine writing on the 1st of December 2025.
That's quite something, isn't it?
It really is, my word.
And it's also quite a story, or series of stories.
Yeah.
Important to say from the start, though, we didn't want to do yet another rerun of Jancis's life story or career.
Yeah.
That's been done. Not least in her autobiography, Confessions of a Wine Lover, or Tasting Pleasure in the US.
It's a great book, right?
What we wanted to do was get an insight into Jancis, the human being in the round. You know, what makes her tick, how her process works, her response to some of the more controversial moments in her career, her views on the current state of wine, and then how she sees the future.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to do something fresh and different with this one, didn't we?
Yeah.
We're lucky enough to, have got to know Jancis and her husband, Nick, quite a bit over the years. And we wanted to touch on, I don't know, maybe some of the things that don't often get discussed about Jancis in the public arena. Also, perhaps to seek clarity on other key issues. She's such an important figure in wine that, we wanted to really get under her skin and give this the time and the focus it warranted.
And on that note, we've split this interview into two parts to make it more digestible and to give Jancis's words a bit more breathing space. We think it works really nicely and we hope you enjoy it. So whatever you do, don't miss the concluding second part when we challenge Jancis to a quickfire question round and quiz her about all sorts of juicy things.
Yeah, okay. So we need to do a bit of a preface before we get into the interview proper. And this intro will be split between the two episodes, so we don't end up repeating ourselves. But to start here, if we're being really scrupulous, and probably a bit obsequious too, we'd introduce her as Dr. Jancis Robinson, OBE, MW, MA, DUniv, to include recognitions from the Open University, the honorary doctorate, Oxford University, the Institute of Masters of Wine, and the Queen. Not a bad lineup of credentials, is it, as credentials go?
And of course, testament to that is the fact that she's one of those rare people who only needs one name for unquestionable recognition. She is Jancis.
Like Beyonce.
I don't think Jancis is much like Beyonce. I'm not sure she'd quite like that.
The one name.
Anyway, she got into wine during and after her time at Oxford. After university in 1975, she joined a wine trade magazine, and there then followed a succession of articles, columns, books and TV programmes. In 1984, she became the first person outside the wine trade to pass the demanding Master of Wine exams. In terms of reference books, in 1994 she published the first edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine, and in 2001 she joined forces with Hugh Johnson, who of course we also interviewed on the pod, to co-author the 5th edition of the World Atlas of Wine. These were the first editions of several that Jancis has been involved with in both cases.
She's certainly been a constant presence and guiding light throughout both our wine careers. One of the major initiatives she undertook was launching her subscription-based website, jancisrobinson.com, in 2000, which means it's celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. She's built up a fabulous team around the website of contributors, editors and experts, including Julia Harding, who mentored both of us through our Master of Wine exams. And in 2021, Jancis successfully sold the website, something we'll be discussing further in the next episode.
And of course, we had her on the podcast recently talking about her glassware range, which she developed in 2018 with designer Richard Brendan. Here's a sample quote from that.
I've always, throughout my life, communicating about wine, I go for simplification, practicality, and welcoming people in, making it less snooty and complicated.
Cheers to that.
Yeah.
Her husband, Nick Lander, is a former restaurateur turned writer, restaurant reviewer and food service consultant. And her son, Will, is a current restaurateur with the Quality Chop House in Clerkenwell, among other venues.
Now, this is all necessary information to preface this first part of our chat. There are many other fabulous sources of information on Jancis's life and career, including her website, if you'd like to find out more. We'd also flag up an upcoming podcast series on her very own, appropriately named, the jancisrobinson.com podcast, helmed by our fellow Master of Wine and expert podcaster, Richard Hemming. That one's going to be a really deep dive into every decade of her life, including all the early stuff, and starring some stellar names from the world of wine as special guests. So well worth checking out when it drops around, I think, October, November 2025 time.
Right, I reckon it's high time we heard from the lady herself.
Yeah.
And this is how she introduced herself.
I'm Jancis Robinson, and on the 1st of December this year, I will celebrate my 50th anniversary writing about wine.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
We're sitting in your very wonderful, elegant, beautiful flat with stunning views over London. It's summer 2025. How are you feeling about life in general?
A nice, simple question. I feel very, very lucky, I suppose, because I really love my work. I have no intention of giving it up unless forced to. I used to overwork terribly when I ran jancisrobinson.com myself, pretty much, with an increasing number of people on the team. But I was in charge of everything, like, finance, planning, commissioning, all sorts of things. And since I sold the website in 2021, we have a wonderful managing editor, Tara Q. Thomas, who does all the nasty stuff. leaving me to do nothing other than taste, write, and travel, which are the three things I absolutely love.
So life is fun.
Work life is great, and we're very, very lucky because we have 3 wonderful children, 6 wonderful grandchildren, and they all live within walking distance. So what's not to like, really?
Yeah. And this area of just walking here from the tube station, it's so buzzy.
King's Cross, yeah. And so we moved in 2016 from a Victorian family house in Belsize Park to something completely new, with all sorts of excitements, with lots of young people around. And I think that's more exciting than downsizing to somewhere where you used to be but smaller, which is a bit defeatist.
Now, as you said, this year, 2025, marks your 50th year and 50th anniversary of wine writing. How would you describe your personal as well as professional relationship with wine?
Love it. I was thinking about it. I'm probably addicted to it because I do drink. I'm a boomer, so it's too late for me to go on a health kick, I'm afraid. And I have this very dangerous grandmother who was a big fan of gin. And when she was in her 80s, was heard on what she would call the wireless that too much gin was bad for you. So she switched to whiskey and lived till she was 98. So I'm hoping I've got quite a few of her genes. But I do drink wine every day, and I enjoy it. And I'd see a huge difference between tasting and drinking, as you know. Tasting is what we do hypercritically during the day and spit every mouthful out. And drinking is the enjoying bit.
So you taste, but also you do drink and you enjoy.
Love it.
You make sure you have fun with it as well as...
Oh, I love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah.
You temporarily lost your sense of smell.
Oh, yes.
Didn't you, a few years back?
Well, I had
what was that like?
Was terrible. I got a really bad cold virus. It was way before COVID. And actually flying out to South Africa to judge a wine competition. And of course, there's no way I could, pretend. But what was quite interesting was, although I'd lost my sense of smell, I got something from my palate. And it was spooky how similar my judgments were to the fully functioning judges, actually. And I came back, still no sense of smell whatsoever. And my children would sort of wave perfume bottles under my nose and say, surely you can smell that, Mum. And I couldn't. And in fact, the only time I've been as a guest to Chelsea Flower Show was during that period when I couldn't smell all those lovely flowers. And the doctors couldn't help. And I was all ready to sort of make an announcement and sort of say, I'm sorry, but my career's over. Although the doctor said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I think it probably will come back. But medical science actually didn't seem to help, but Nick was having some acupuncture at the time, so I went to an acupuncturist. And after my very first session, my nose started to sort of twitch. And that evening, I did actually get some of my smell back. Not immediately, but thank the Lord, it was restored.
That must have been terrifying.
It was. It really was, yeah. And then I had a bad pneumonia. I was hospitalized with it at the end of the beginning of 2024. And I didn't lose my sense of smell, but I got this thing where I lost my desire to drink wine. Everything tasted metallic and nasty, wine in particular.
Gosh. Okay. So you've
but
been
that was over quite soon.
Yeah. But during those times, that must have felt, professionally and personally.
But at least I knew that it wasn't forever the second time.
Yeah. Sure. And now, you've written about how wine appealed to you at an early age because it combined huge sensual pleasure with great intellectual stimulation. How do you strike the balance between the hedonist and the intellectual in you, when it comes to making and communicating judgments about wine and wineries and wine people?
Interesting question. I have a horror of boring people about wine. And I think if you were to ask my friends, I don't think any of them would go, oh, God, sit at a table with Jancis and she'll tell you what side of the valley the grapes were grown on. Don't do that at all. But obviously I am paid to impart information about wine. I try and keep it as interesting as possible and not too nerdy. I mean, I think the place for nerdiness is probably the Master of Wine exam room rather than the website or a column in the Financial Times. But as you know, it is difficult to match words to the taste of wine. I mean, there are two things in your question, aren't there? There is the background to the wine. And sometimes I try and pick out the most interesting, often human elements to that. I love describing people and their quirks and so forth. Or the more journalistic aspect of my life, sort of what's new. But actually finding words to convey the taste of things is a real challenge. If you think about all those many food programs on TV, and the least interesting bit of them is when the dish is tasted and the TV host has to describe what they're feeling when they taste it. And it's rubbish, really. I mean, they just say, You know, I sometimes think the ideal tasting note is just, you know.
And a big smiley face.
Yes, yeah.
So, you know, I mean, going into the personal thing a little bit more, you know, you've described yourself in the past as a wine connoisseur most days and then a wine lover every night. Sometimes an excessively ardent wine lover.
Oh, I think this is
I'm intrigued by that. How does that manifest? I'm just intrigued. How does that manifest itself?
With particular company. There is just a small group of us who get together, I don't know, every few months and taste ridiculous number of bottles.
And what would those people say the excessively ardent Jancis Robinson is like?
I'm teased because I'm not a sort of obvious drunk. I don't climb on the table or shout or anything like that. No, they tease me because my most frequent compliment about a wine is very fresh. So I say, nice freshness. And then one of them is always going, very fresh.
I'm also sort of fascinated by how the Jancis process works. You know, you write in your autobiography that you can be very friendly in the flesh, which I absolutely concur with, but also coldly objective or even brutal in print.
At the keyboard. This is true.
So give us an insight into that. How does that process work?
Okay. I think I remember contrasting with my very frequent early wine travel companion, who was Tony Lord. He was Australian, the first editor of Decanter. And he was the most ill-behaved winery guest, you know, terribly rude to his hosts and rather boorish, really. Very good fun to travel with. But when he was writing it up in Decanter, everything was absolutely marvellous, you know.
Oh, so he went the other way?
We went completely the other way, yes. Whereas I would be a very well-behaved guest. But I suppose my early days on the Sunday Times probably informed my objective journalistic streak. And I suppose I have a horror of seeming bought, if you like. I don't go short of good meals. And if anybody, you know, especially not having a restaurant critic for a husband and a restaurateur for a son. So if anyone thinks that I can be bought with a good lunch, they're wrong. Yeah, I just think you owe it to, part of my job is not to be a PR person for the wine industry. So everything I think I and our team on jancisrobinson.com write is for the consumer. It's not for the producer, which is probably why our tasting notes are not, well, my tasting notes anyway, are not very often used as a sales pitch, because they are genuinely my stream of consciousness as I taste a wine, rather than what will sell the wine.
No, your notes are very fresh and frank, and
I'm afraid so.
No, but that's lovely in an era where sometimes they can be overly ornate and baroque.
Yes, I do remember the lovely late Ben Collins from Bibendum once ringing me up and saying, "Did you really mean to write just that?" I think about one wine I did write, "Well, it's wet.
That bad.
I think so.
You are famously parsimonious. I think is that
Yes,
fair to say? When it comes to scoring wines?
Absolutely plead guilty to that.
It's rare a wine gets more than 18 out of 20.
Although we do have literally hundreds of scores out of 20 out of 20.
Out of 20, exactly. So you do have some high scores.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
So why? Why is that? Why is it because you dislike what might seem like a definitively enthusiastic statement about a wine, or is it you want to leave headroom for ever improving wines?
Exactly, because the quality of wine in my lifetime has soared leaps and bounds. Every year, the average quality of wine seems higher than it was the year before, and we are leaving ourselves headroom between that 18 and 20. And I think, I haven't done the analysis, but I suspect our average scores have definitely been going up and up, as average wine quality has been going up and up and up. And in fact, it's very rare to find a really bad wine nowadays. You can find lots of boring ones if you look not that carefully, but very rare to find, and so many exciting wines. So we've got the headroom, whereas those who started, who gave 100 points in the last century have not got any headroom.
So if we pause there for a moment, it is an interesting point that about leaving yourself wiggle room when it comes to scores. On the one hand, it's understandable, and there's nothing worse than constant breathless over-enthusiasm. On the other, I guess you could argue this in perpetuity, that wine will keep getting better and better. Horses for courses, I guess. And she admits her approach does tend to err on the critical side of things when it comes to rating wines, even if she doesn't like to be called a wine critic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know lots of producers and merchants who throw up their hands in frustration when it comes to many of her scores. She might write a really enthusiastic tasting note, but then give it quite a modest score. But she did point out that she does give 20 out of 20 occasionally. She's actually given that perfect score on more than 150 wines if you check her website like I did. I mean, they tend to be obviously the classics from a amazing vintage 70 years ago, but I might be generalising unfairly there. But, she has given a perfect score, so that's fair enough. And on a related note, I did like her take that the ideal tasting note was just, So Homer Simpson would agree, I think.
Not sure we can quite talk about Homer and Jancis in the same breath. On the subject of comedy, though, I do like the idea of her friends ribbing her with a very fresh epithet.
Yes, very fresh. Maybe just think about it. She could be the Fresh Princess of King's Cross. Does that work? No. Okay, maybe not. Let's move on. How bad must the wine have been for her tasting note to have been, "It's wet"?
That is tempting to write sometimes, though, isn't it?
I know what she means. Yeah.
Seriously.
It's so funny. But the fact she probably published it too. It reminded me of our profile on Hugh Johnson, which, of course, subscribers can check out in our uncut bonus episode, when he totally rejected the concept of scoring wines numerically. But he did admit to having his own system of ranking, the lowest rung on which was one sniff. So, it meant the wine was so bad, he'd only take one sniff of it and no more.
That was it.
Yeah, one sniff.
And the other end of the scale was liking it so much you'd buy not just a whole case, but even the whole chateau.
Which he did.
Okay, so I think it's time to take a breath before coming up for more. By way of brief recap so far, Jancis Robinson is a living wine legend, prolific author, presenter, columnist, and all-round communicator. Charming in the flesh, but often brutal in print, she is celebrating 50 years of wine writing and has no intention whatsoever of giving up. In fact, despite some tasting faculty scares in recent years, she seems more enthused than ever. Sometimes over-enthusiastic too.
Yeah. So when we left off, we were discussing scoring wines. And I wanted to bring up Robert Parker, the American lawyer turned wine critic behind The Wine Advocate, who popularised the 100-point score and became fabulously influential in his time, which was, I guess, around the turn of the century and shortly after, before he retired in 2019. His big thing was reviewing and scoring wines, particularly red Bordeaux, at a time when global demand was on the up.
He was so powerful that Parkerization became a term, whereby winemakers would create wines to suit Parker's perceived taste for rich, ripe, creamy styles, because wines that obtained high Parker points would reap the financial rewards in terms of sales. And they were considerable by all accounts. Flying winemakers and consultants like the influential Frenchman Michel Rolland were very much associated with this particular trend.
And then in 2004, Jancis and Parker had a very public disagreement about the style and quality of one particular Bordeaux wine, the Saint-Emilion Chateau Pavie 2003, owned by Gérard Perse. This was a vintage that had been baking hot. Jancis tasted it blind and called it porty, ridiculous, completely unappetizing. Parker called it one of the wines of the vintage and accused Jancis of having an anti-Pavie agenda and not tasting it blind. But that's enough prefacing. Back to the chat. So talking about 100 points, we can't have this discussion about scores without mentioning Robert Parker, the American wine critic who popularised the 100-point score. And someone you got to know quite well.
As far as I
understand.
We had dinner in each other's houses and so on. I often wonder what he's doing now.
I was going to say, he stepped back from frontline wine.
Well, since I think the last time he wrote was 2016.
That's a while.
Like 9 years
ago. He did say
ago.
He was going to retire and be a very sort of satisfied gourmand or something along those lines, didn't he? Which maybe he's doing. Who knows? Yeah. But how would you evaluate his legacy, both positive and negative?
Positive, I suppose, drawing the whole world of wine lovers and wine producers together, unifying them, I suppose, by questionable slavish following of numbers, but introducing a whole load of people who didn't necessarily speak English to the joys of wine by a very comprehensible system of these numbers. I suppose it's arguable that wine would not have grown as rapidly in Asia if there hadn't been numerical scores for people to latch on to, who didn't perhaps fully understand the subtleties of a tasting note. Negative would be, although his power was negative, and he didn't set out to be that powerful at all. It wasn't his fault that everybody slavishly followed him, and it was understandable why people followed him. He was a very reliable, consistent, good taster that, although he denied it, he clearly did have a particular preference for particular wines. Bigger the better, which I think is probably why he never really got to grips with Burgundy, and Burgundy certainly didn't really get to grips with him. And there was a time when it was regrettable that, if not winemakers, then winemakers' bosses were telling them all to make wines that would appeal to Robert Parker, or the people who were feeding, the US importers who were feeding samples to Robert Parker, or the odd wine consultant, Michel Rolland, who was famously a good friend of Parker's. And so there was a certain sameness of wine style that did infect the wine world over the turn of the century, sort of late 90s, early 2000s. But, for every action, there's a reaction. So he had all these younger American wine writers sort of being anti-Parker and let's have wine as pale as possible or as acid as possible. And I remember that, there was a time when every wine producer wanted to make a copy of Red Bordeaux and a copy of White Burgundy. And those days are way over. And there's been a lot of experimentation with a far wider array of grape varieties, which is really, really healthy. And do you remember there was a book, I can't remember who wrote it, that I think was called Godforsaken Grapes, because Parker came out with this rant at one stage about all these new wines made from godforsaken grapes, which was quite funny. I do wonder whether the pendulum has swung too far towards too pale, too tart.
Too natural?
That's a whole nother thing, I would say. But even mainstream, I'd say perhaps some Australian winemakers, of the new wave Australians, are picking the grapes so early to avoid being accused of being heavy and big and alcoholic that sometimes they're sacrificing a bit of flavour. I mean, this is not a general criticism, but just the odd, I see signs of that. And also, having seen pendulums, been around for so long, and seeing pendulums swing, I do wonder whether, and I'm very, very pro the current pendulum that is swinging towards white wine, because when I started, white wine was all the rage. Everybody was desperate to get a Chardonnay. There weren't all that many Chardonnay grapes in the world, actually. And then it swung very rapidly towards red wine, not least, I think, because of Parker's enthusiasm, really, greater enthusiasm for red wine. And now I love the fact that white wine is seeing the light again, partly perhaps because of climate change and people looking for freshness.
Freshness, it comes back to freshness, so ahead of the curve. Of course, talking about Parker is topical because Gerard Peirce very sadly recently died.
We're not going to talk about Pavie 03, are we?
Just a little bit. So I know you've talked about it many times, but we have to just touch on that. Yeah, and also because I think partly, I think it gets to what your taste is.
Yeah, maybe. But, and I'd noted that in an obituary of Gerard Peirce, it was said that Parker and I glossed over our differences, which is not the right way to put it. We were both in the same... for context, for people who were not around in the exciting days of 2004, when there was a strong difference of opinion about Chateau Pavie 2003, me thinking it was just overdone, Parker loving it, and accusing me of knowing what it was, when in fact I tasted it blind. So that there was a bit of having been to dinner in each other's houses, we separated a little bit after that. And I can't remember exactly when it was. It could have been about 2010 or just before then. We were both in the same Bordeaux hotel, in the same breakfast room. And so we kissed and made up. And he said, "That Pavie thing, I overreacted." So that was nice.
And obviously, but this is a time in terms of the wider global wine scene when, as you say, wines were getting ever bigger, ever richer, ever more alcoholic. And Bordeaux seemed to be chasing that. Obviously, it's normal.
Yeah, Bordeaux changed its style quite a bit. Yeah.
What are we seeing about that now, 20 years on?
I do admire Bordeaux University, and they're really on top of every little nuance of winemaking and how to improve and react to the weather and all that kind of thing. I think although the world has slightly turned against the style of red Bordeaux, it's got impatient. It's because really although I'm convinced that the best value wines in the world are those on the kind of basic Petit Chateau rung of Bordeaux, because they're unfashionable and overproduced. Well, there are too many of them. So prices are ridiculously low, even for some quite mature wines. To really appreciate Bordeaux at its finest, you need something a notch or two above that, and you need a cellar or to pay through the nose for storage charges, because the Bordelais like selling their wines far too young, and hold on to it for years and years to really make the price of it pay in terms of pleasure, because although they're trying to make their wines more drinkable young, which is understandable and laudable, to get max pleasure, you really, with a really good Bordeaux, you do need a decade or two. So that's a pretty big commitment, and especially in our impatient era when people want immediate gratification. So I think Bordeaux is better than it's ever been in terms of quality, and the whites are certainly way better than they were, but more difficult to sell.
So correct me if I'm wrong, you just said that for you some of the best bargains in the wine world are humble Bordeaux.
Yeah, Petit Chateau Bordeaux, not branded Bordeaux, but say, a well-made Cru Bourgeois costs next to nothing, and it can't find a market, and it does mature faster than a class growth. So it can be jolly nice at 5 years old.
Now, going back to wine schools, arguably one result of the wine school fever was sort of price inflation, particularly among the top properties, particularly in Bordeaux. How do you feel about that trend?
Unhappy. I remember a wonderful wine merchant, Simon Loftus of Adnams. I think we had to do a little talk somewhere together, and he expressed a sentiment which I've heard many people say of, I was turned on to wine by a wonderful, mature first growth, and the young people of today are never going to be able to do that because the wines are so expensive. My counter argument to that is that the range of wines available today is so infinitely wider than it used to be, and you don't have to just worship the old classic traditional supposedly top wines. You can find marvellous wines from countries that were never, probably not even in the World Atlas of Wine in its first or second edition, from a huge array of grapes and made in lots and lots of different styles. So I think anybody youngish getting into wine today is probably more thrilled by the variety than sort of notching off, I've tasted Romani Conti kind of thing. And of course, this is all in parallel with the fact that the number of billionaires in the world has mushroomed, and billionaires need billionaires' wines. They need a wine that has a massive price tag that they can tell their friends, if they've got any, that they've bought, or they own, or they've tasted.
But your advice to people maybe these days would be find that sensational, life-changing bottle of maybe Australian Pinot Noir or Chilean Cabernet, or whatever it is somewhere else.
Keep experimenting and notice what you like. And there's an old trope, but don't follow what other people like or what other people worship. Put it that way. Yeah.
Do you think there is a kind of good wine lover and a bad wine lover type? And if so, what? Let's say you're sitting down for a meal and you think, gosh, this person's genuine love of wine and something that's genuinely positive. What would you say characterises, beyond a love of wine?
Somebody who's actually noticing the taste rather than the reputation or the score or the price. I love my wine dinners with friends. Love them. And that is huge, huge enjoyment. But I have had my share of wine dinners with collectors. That's not always that much fun. It's just, I'll tell you about this wine I've had, and then somebody else says, but I'll trump that with this wine I've had. There's more. I mean, the great thing about wine is it facilitates conversation, and not just conversation about wine. That's what I love.
And we will be continuing this intriguing conversation, and not just about wine, in the next and concluding episode, when we'll be touching on the Queen, influencers, setting up then selling her website, negotiating with lawyers in a swimsuit, Cumbria, anorexia, regenerative viticulture, cans, and other hot potatoes.
Just before we end, though, Jancis did email after our chat to clarify, and I quote, "What I should have added about Parker's power was that it was stoked by the fact that he always acted as though his opinion was the only possible one." Whereas you get the sense from Jancis, she's very clear about how subjective wine tasting is, and that it's quite common for many different opinions to be valid about the same wine, and the score isn't everything.
And interesting what she also said about Bordeaux Petit Chateau being some of the best bargains in the wine world right now. I mean, I suppose if you like that style.
Yeah, exactly. That was a great tip. If you're into that thing, I'd say we could go and grab one out of the cellar to quickly review and then drink tonight, but that's not really our bag, is it?
Not really.
We don't really have those. Really. There you go. Horses for courses again, I guess. One other thing our cellar certainly won't be packing is billionaire wine. Sadly, I remember in her autobiography, Jancis writing about feeling, and I quote, physically sick at certain wines becoming investment vehicles because their price had gone up so much, and describing the fine wine inflation rate of the 90s as absurd. So I think when she says she's a bit unhappy, about that trend, it may be an understatement. Let's put it that way.
Right, let's draw things to a close on that note of understatement,
A rare one.
because it does lead nicely into the concluding part of our conversation in the next episode of this exclusive Jancis Robinson two-parter. Do join us there. You can do that right now if you're a Wine Blast Plus subscriber. If you'd like to subscribe, head to wineblast.co.uk to sign up. Thanks to Jancis Robinson, and thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.